we are a long way from full employment.
A strong labor market that is sustained for an extended period can deliver substantial economic and social benefits. At present, we are a long way from such a labor market.
That's what Jay Powell, the president of the US Central Bank Fed, said only 1 year ago in February 2021. How has the situation changed since then? And which indicators is Jay Powell and his colleagues at the Fed looking at when they assess the situation on the labor market? Find out now in the Geldcast update.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
I have prepared 4 labor market indicators for you today. One of them has been somewhat puzzling in the last couple of months and years. We will discuss this figure in the end of the show. But the other 3 indicators have a very clear message. The labor market in the US is doing great. Figure 1 I want to discuss is the unemployment rate. Prior to the pandemic, it was 3.5%. That had been the lowest number since the 1950s. Then Corona hit, and within weeks, the unemployment rate shot up to 14.3%. That was a new record too. It had not been this high in almost 90 years. Where is the unemployment rate today? It has recovered extremely quickly. Today it stands at around 4%. This has been one of the fastest recovery in the US labor market, especially compared to the recovery after the great financial crisis of 2008. After the burst of the subprime mortgage bubble in the US, it took the unemployment rate almost 10 years to go back to pre-crisis levels. Today, the US is only about 0.5 percentage point away from pre-crisis levels. The recovery only took about 2 years instead of 10. The labor market is really doing great. Figure 2 I want to discuss is the job openings to unemployment ratio. Let's first look back before we discuss today's numbers. In April 2020, when the pandemic was on the peak of the first wave, there was only about 1 job opening per 5 unemployed people. The waiter or the banker who got fired during the pandemic had little to no chance at all to find a new job. Today this is very different. Let's hear what Jay Powell has to say about it.
There are many millions of more job openings than there are unemployed people.
For every unemployed person, there are currently 1.3 job openings. This is good news for the unemployed people. The ratio between job openings and unemployed people is in fact extremely high. Jason Furman of the Harvard University showed that in a blog post for the Peterson Institute for International Economics. In the last 20 years, there had only been about 2 years in which this indicator stood higher. The labor market is doing great. Figure 3 I want to discuss is the quits rate. This indicator measures how many people quit their jobs. High quits rates mean that more people change their jobs. If the economy is doing poorly, people usually stay put. They do not change their jobs. During the first wave of COVID in spring 2020, only about 16 out of 1,000 people changed their job per month. It stands now almost twice as high, at 30 quits per 1,000 people and month. The labor market in the US is doing great. And here is how Jay Powell assesses the current state of the labor market.
This is, by so many measures, a historically tight labor market. Record levels of job openings, of quits. If you look at surveys of workers, they find jobs plentiful. Look at surveys of companies, they find workers scarce. And all of those readings are at levels really that we haven't seen in a long time, and in some cases ever.
This is good news for the people who graduate college, and it's also good news for the waiter that have been fired during the pandemic. In the current environment, it is relatively easy to find a new job in the US. But it's not only good news for the workers, but also for Jay Powell himself at the Fed. This is so because he's not only responsible to keeping inflation in check, the Fed mandate is also to aim for full employment. But there is one key labor market figure that has been somewhat puzzling in the last couple of months: the labor force participation rate. Prior to COVID, 63.4% of all Americans were either looking for a job or working. This number is now at 62.2%. That means that people have dropped out of the labor force. They quit their jobs for good, or at least for some time. About a third of that decline can be attributed to aging. There are a lot of people who got retired in the last 2 years, and not so many people who entered the labor force. Importantly though, it is unclear whether or not the low labor force participation rate is indeed a negative sign. One could argue that it would have fallen anyway, even if there had not been a pandemic. The unemployment rate, the job openings to unemployment ratio, the quits rate, all 3 numbers point into the same direction. The the labor market in the US is doing great. The only thing that is a bit strange is the labor force participation rate, but most people have stopped worrying too much about it. Of course, the downside of the great labor market situation is the high inflation numbers. If you want to find out more about inflation, check out my previous episode of the Geldcast update titled "Why is inflation so high in the US?" Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.